Join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Cecelia Tichi.
I thank Wendy Martin. She and I have collaborated recently on a collection of short stories, best of times, worst of times, about these times. Let me ask you, how many in the room are concentrators in the field of literary study? Okay. How about the social sciences? Good, all right. Anyone from the so-called hard sciences? Just curious, all right. Just so we think about interpretation, and by the way, I'm rather tethered to this microphone because of the recording device, so I am cautioned I need not stray. Otherwise, I would join you. If we were to consult a reading specialist, that person would tell us immediately that there's no such thing as reading per se. Those who read for extractable data are more frequently in the sciences, social, physical, biological. The humanities, as we learn, requires us to develop techniques of indirect reading. This is very troubling to many students, to cross from one to the other, and it must be taught as a skill. No one, I think, is born knowing how to read a metaphor, and just this is what we all know, but we need to be reminded. The act of interpretation is what often defines humanity. Scientists looking at data sets, trying to puzzle out what's important, what's not, what's peripheral, what's major. For those of us in the humanities, as Professor Martin has just made clear, there are shifting popular trends that must necessarily displace others. And if in your career you're not ready to be displaced, don't go there. There comes a point, just file this, when you will need to learn from people younger than you and be revitalized therefore. When Professor Martin and I began our work, we were both new critical readers. Had we stayed there, we would both be, first, antediluvian, and second, bereft of resources that are so revitalizing over the years. So I have asked you, obviously, for today to spend time reading a rather long novel by Jack London, The Sea Wolf, a bestseller from the year 1904. It very quickly sold 500,000 copies in cloth, and at a time when the U.S. population was roughly 75 to 85 million persons. London estimated that he reached, by way of stories and his books borrowed, lent, lying around, upwards of 3% of the U.S. population. He was the most popular writer in the United States in his time, meaning from about 1898 to his death in 1916. Participating in that two-decade era in which leading intellectuals strove, if you like, to shift public attitudes and make an impact on public policy from the Gilded Age to what we call the progressive era. Let's position London today. He has dropped out of the graduate and undergraduate syllabus largely because he has been thought in a feminist era to be hyper-masculinist. He has dropped as well because at a time when racial theory was commonplace, he's considered to be racist. We will find the N-word in his Tales of the South Seas. Fortunately, all along, year after year, there have been scholars devoted to his work, identifying him with the movements of realism, of naturalism, of modernism, and most recently, Professor Gene Reisman of the University of Texas at San Antonio has written a book, published it, called Jack London's Racial Lives, in which he shows definitively, with data, that London's ideas of race changed over his career. And you can find this in his books. So if we ask, is the moment ripe for some kind of resurgence of interpretation of Jack London, I would say that we have an opportunity, using London today as the model, an opportunity to move toward one more relationship of the writer, the literary writer, to the culture. You just asked questions that drew responses familiar to us. There's feminism, there's philosophy, there's psychoanalysis, there's racial theory. All these become quite familiar. I hope they're familiar to you. And as Arnold Ramper said, giving a lecture, the late, I believe he's no longer living, a lecture over the last few years at my university, asked by a graduate student, how do we do our own thing? Professor Ramper said, then of Stanford, said, first you must enter into the conversations that are occurring at the time of your graduate study. You enter fully into them, and from them you find your way to something new. London, Jack London, is one of the writers who, perhaps like Kipling, is thought to be a teller of adventure tales, seafaring tales. He's been a photographer, an adventurer in the Klondike, and so on and so on. I want to suggest one other possible, and this is London as model, but let me emphasize, I'm really talking about the example he might set, and that is the writer of fiction, and poetry perhaps, as public intellectual. The writer as public intellectual. What might this mean? That this is an effort through fiction and some nonfiction and from poetry to shape public opinion in political, even ideological ways, with an end project of the development of public policy, all toward a refashioning of the world for a better common life for many more people. Why don't we already understand writers to be public intellectuals? The phrase Dickensian is so familiar that we don't even have to have read Dickens to know what it means. So who were our American, and who are our American, perhaps, public intellectual writers, and why haven't they been outed or presented as public intellectuals? I want to suggest that those in the disciplines best qualified for this sort of work have refused to do it, and I mean historians and people in political science. Why is that? Because literature has not been regarded as a suitable database for their work. We have a few exceptions that prove the rule. Historians will cite Upton Sinclair's The Jungle for having moved the Congress toward the passage of the 1906 Federal Food and Beverage Act, which required inspection, and to this day is still on the books, inspection of meat, of beverages, and of medicines that cross state lines. That bill had been clogged up in Congress for 17 years because of the pressure of the meat packers, the beverage industry. They didn't want it. But meanwhile, there was on the part of local groups deep concern about contamination of food and beverages and of toxic medicines. After all, Louisa May Alcott, taking mercury-laced medicine for her ills, became poison. So the jungle pushed Congress to act. Theodore Roosevelt, then president, sent 2 inspectors to Chicago to see whether Upton Sinclair's novel was just a sort of cartoon. and the inspectors telegraphed Roosevelt saying things are worse than the novel presents. And so Roosevelt and Congress finally passed that bill. So The Jungle is held up as an important piece of fiction that's changed American history. So has the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know this. Professor Larry Reynolds has a new book on that very topic, how Uncle Tom's Cabin changed American history. And in this political season, we're hearing that vice presidential nominee on the Republican ticket, Paul Ryan, was deeply influenced by Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, as was Alan Greenspan in his youth, former Federal Reserve chair, who became a kind of oracle in his time. So these novels, you may not like one or another of them, but historians will say, yes, these are novels that have triggered changes in public policy and are important, and we should know about them. At the same time, they are the exceptions that seem to prove the rule. What has been the public, sort of the guidance about fiction in the United States? The Puritan minister, Increase Mather, fearful that fiction would lead his parishioners away from established doctrine, called fiction vain romances which a foolish creature chooseth to misspend his time in reading. Swat. Moving into the late 18th century, Jefferson, in a letter to Nathaniel Burwell, called fiction, among many other things, quote, a mass of trash. In the late 19th century, then, a time when, as Professor Martin reminds us, the disciplines narrowed themselves, when sociology, political science, and economics, which were one, became three. In that period, as the social sciences developed, historians went with science. Political studies of government became political science, and they wanted to detach from those who wrote stories for entertainment. So we have a great divide that's over a century old. We now then have an opportunity, because the term public intellectual is so prevalent now, because scholars from Richard Posner to Cornel West are regularly termed public intellectuals. We have the opportunity to look at literary figures and see them in a new light. The reason this is new in America and is not elsewhere is simply obvious if we look abroad. Notice Umberto Eco, a scholar, a writer of fiction, and a diplomat serving in the Italian government. You find other figures who regularly write fiction, write literary criticism, and serve in the diplomatic service of their nations throughout Latin America, throughout Europe. Václav Havel, a playwright, and he becomes the president of the nation. Is it conceivable in this country that a novelist could become the president? Maybe in your lifetime. All right? So we're in a kind of parochial bind because of particularities of our history. But we can get out of that bind, I think, now. We need also to take note that the public intellectual traditionally has an affiliation with a think tank or a university, or perhaps a prominent journal. Also true in Jack London's time. The writer who is not so affiliated, you have to make a case for that person. There's a fine line between, on the one hand, celebrity, and on the other, public intellectual. There's a line between dilettante and knowledgeable figure whose narratives deserve our attention because they encode socio-political truths that we need to recognize. Now, what I would like to do is sort of take us through, before we get to the sea wolf, to take us through a series of PowerPoint images of London's life. Here he is, a young man in his early 20s. Please notice the soft collar and that tie that looks more like a scarf. At a time when, gentlemen, you would have worn a starched collar detachable from your shirt, long cuffs, that collar would have looked not like his, but stiff, and you would have had a cravat very carefully tied and well defined. London's look in sportswear, we'll call it today, defines him as a bohemian. Not someone who's careless about dress, but someone making a statement. I am not of the bourgeoisie. I may have friends there, and he did. He consorted. He's a very genial guy. But in his very choice of wardrobe, he's telling us that he's off to the side from that class. So, here he is as a little boy. Everyone starts somewhere. He's born in 1876. You see how hand-colored by a studio portraiturist that image is. I need to tell you that he was very poor. This is his stepfather. Jack London did not know that London was not his father until he was 21. He did not know that he was the bastard son of an astrologer who fled when the woman he had impregnated refused to abort. He sold the household furnishings and skipped out. His name was William Cheney. Jack London was baptized or christened as John Griffin Cheney. Within 6 months, his mother, who I'll show us in a moment, had married this man, John London, a semi-disabled Civil War veteran. His lungs had been damaged very seriously in firefights. All that, those clouds of gunpowder had permanently scarred his lungs. He had been in Iowa, an expert grower of prized vegetables, and he came west. He had 3 children. He himself was widowed. Within 6 months of meeting Flora Wellman, they married and combined their families of his 2 children by then because his little boy had died. And we're seeing him late in his life at about 1897. That star on his chest is that of a night watchman. That was his last job. He hardly earned any money. He farmed up and down the peninsula, often foreclosed. The family moved all the time. One ramshackle Oakland house after another, and it was tough. There's Flora. Jack London, and he became Jack by his own choice in grade school. He found his mother to be cold and rigid. She did 2 terrific things for him. She had come from a well-to-do Ohio family. She split off from her family because she too was interested in astrology and seances. She earned some of her living conducting seances in the San Francisco area and teaching elocution lessons. By marrying John London, she became respectable again. When he left her, pregnant, with no furniture, She shot herself. Whether it was a serious suicide attempt or not is not known. Turned out to be a flesh wound. The birth was difficult, and her physician advised her to find a wet nurse for the baby. Jack London was nursed by a former slave named Virginia Prentice. I don't have a photograph of her. She looks very warm. There is a photograph, and she's cuddling him. She not only nursed him through his infancy, but provided the warmth to him that Flora, he felt, denied him. All his life, Jack London supported that black former slave, making sure that her needs were met, that she had a place to live, enough money for food, clothing, and meeting all her expenses. Flora did, I said, two wonderful things for Jack. She taught him to read early, and when he had almost no chance of becoming a professional writer and had an opportunity to become a postal employee, a letter carrier, he had taken the civil service test, he'd passed it, there was an opening. She said, "Take a chance on your writing. Let's take the chance." The basis of her backing him is that he had entered a writing contest sponsored by the San Francisco Morning Call newspaper. So many words, an adventure, and he beat out two Stanford students and won. He wrote a description of a typhoon off the islands of Japan that he had experienced as a young seaman in his teens at age 17. She kept him awake with coffee while he wrote it. She insisted that he enter it, that he write it. And he did, and he won. $25. The average pay for a worker working 12 or 14 hours a day at the time was about $10 or $11 a week. Here came this 25. That was the lottery ticket for his future, and she backed him. Just so we wouldn't see only his head as a little boy. This is a studio photograph. Chances are those are not his clothes. A studio photographer would keep clothing on hand so that anyone who didn't have highly respectable clothing wherever they lived could put on essentially a costume for the photograph. That is Jack London's dog, Rollo. At the time, there is no evidence to suggest that he was going to feature dogs in his fiction in the future. But it's a charming photograph in some ways. We can see the facial features already. That backdrop is no doubt a painted flat because that is a studio photograph. Flora and John would have had to pony up to get that photograph made. You can see from it that his mother and his stepfather had ideas about respectability, about literacy, about doing things right in society. I'm taking us back here to the year Jack London was born, 1876, and we are in Philadelphia. We hear a lot about the 1892-3 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. If you've read Devil in the White City, that's that fair. This is the one that commemorates the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. We're in Philadelphia here. 10 million people visited this fairgrounds. The country was 3 years into a dreadful depression. So these people were not affected by the Depression. And it was a huge statement about the United States of America now on the world stage in a time of empire, as as Professor Hobsbawm has told us, the age of empire, all the great European countries with their far-flung empires, and the United States ramping up for its own empire. We've sometimes been asked to think that our empire was first internal as we pushed back and through various genocidal acts cleared the land of the native populations in this country. But here is the U.S. getting ready for its moment on the world stage. This is the icon of that fair, the Corliss engine. The reason I'm bringing these the three images of the 1876 Centennial Fair is to position Jack London's birth with the world into which he was born. One of expansion, one of manufacturing acumen and achievement. This Corliss engine produced 2,500 horsepower, and it powered various engines and lighting systems at the fair. It was started in a ceremony presided over by President of Brazil, Don Pedro, and President Grant. They threw the switch, the wheels started to go, and you see the ratio of human size to the size of it. I saw one of these in northern Michigan. It was in use for a copper mine, for refining copper. A question to ask is, what powers this engine at the other end? And the answer is somebody shoveling coal. Manual labor at the very back end. None of that labor is visible here, nor in the previous image of people gathering, the great crowds, men in swallowtail coats and bowler hats, women in bustles and floor-length handmade dresses. 40 yards of material would be nothing. You selected your own accessories and trimmings. Fur, beads, jewels. Your dressmaker made them for you, and of course your tailor. And who's making those things? Who's back there sewing the fur onto the collar, cutting the cloth, lining the coat, shoveling the coal? Here we're still at the fair, we're in the interior. In those glass cases, new consumer items, crystal, Steinway pianos, books, lighting fixtures, every conceivable kind of consumer item. It's now a wealth and abundance of consumerism as of 1876. Ohio had some of the most advanced exhibits. They were a leading manufacturing state. Think Cleveland. California, a grapevine, a barrel of wine, and a very poor boy who would grow up to be famous. It would not have been possible for Flora or John to make the trip east. They couldn't possibly have afforded it, not even on the cheapest Pullman car. So who's making all these wonderful devices? Here are the figures, sort of the founding figures of this Gilded Age, not all of them, sometimes called the moguls, the titans. We've had recently an amazing spate of very lengthy biographies of some of these guys. There's Carnegie. Some thought he looked a little like Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, with his little beard. David Nassau has written, just in the last few years, a very hefty biography. There's John D. Rockefeller, upper left. He also, Ron Chernow, writing doorstop size biographies. How shall I put this? Matthew Josephson in the 30s called them robber barons. The newest term is Titan. And it seems to go with our own Gilded Age, a rethinking of the importance of these figures in defining America, sort of Steve Jobses of their time. And then we have, I think it's Cornelius Vanderbilt, founder of my own university, without whose help I would not, I don't know where I'd be. There he is. Notice that tie, that stiff, starched collar. If we ask, who's doing the starching? Who makes that possible? And there's J.P. Morgan, who in 1901 suckered Carnegie into selling Carnegie Steel, congregated Carnegie Steel, 2 or 3 other steel works, a bridge company, and it became U.S. Steel. So there they are, the titans, the great figures, and I think Chernow also has done the biography, the new one of Morgan. I'm blocking the name of the guy who's just recently done the Vanderbilt biography, but you see my point. These the titans, the moguls, no longer the robber barons. I want to suggest the script in some ways for Jack London's life. Flora is helping, but Jack had also done this kind of work. This is Lewis Hines, well known. You've seen it perhaps elsewhere. It's a very often reproduced image that's called Breaker Boys. These are the kids, boys. Their noses and mouths are sooty because they're breathing so close to coal that's being poured down chutes. Their job was to pluck out the rocks, the stones, so that only the pure coal chunks proceed to whatever fireboxes they await them. Hine became very interested in child labor, and he took an enormous number of photographs. The Library of Congress has a lot of them. Jack London himself did the kind of things that boys often did in the past to earn a few cents. He was a paper boy. He'd beat somebody's rugs. It was before people had vacuum cleaners. You'd throw a rug, a carpet over a clothesline, and then they looked like tennis rackets, and you'd go whacking at and you just basically beat the dust out of the rug. Maybe that would be worth a quarter, something like that. He helped an ice man deliver blocks of ice. He set pins in a bowling alley. Those were the kinds of boy chore work tasks that were thought to build character. But he had other jobs as a young guy, and I want to connect them to this sort of look. He worked in a jute mill for 10 cents an hour in Oakland. The mill was one of the leading manufacturers in Oakland in the closing decades of the 19th century. And once the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, I think, was in force, you couldn't get, if you were a manufacturer of jute, you could no longer get cheap Chinese labor. So you turned to who was around, poor boys, like Jack London, who had gone through elementary school, maybe middle school, not high school. 10 cents an hour for shifts that ran as long as the boss said they needed to run, but at least 12 hours. He once worked 36 hours straight. And it was a matter of eating or not eating. He wrote about it later in a story for a mass market magazine, and the story is called The Apostate. He was asked to write a story for the magazine, and the editor thought maybe child labor would be a good topic. People were becoming interested. People were thinking, the public, maybe kids shouldn't be doing this. Maybe they should be in school. Maybe there should be another way. Here too, this is a Lewis Hine photograph. This is a child in a North Carolina textile mill. Same thing. Very little schooling, off to work, long hours. The reason that the employers liked children is that the little fingers were nimble and could work around the looms. Of course, there was no safety equipment, no regulations for safety. Maiming, dismemberment were often the case. Jack London worked as well in a cannery, and he saw fingers in the blink of an eye gone. He saw the scars from the knives, and it scarred him. So when he fled the jute mill, he became, for a fairly short time, the term is hoboy, H-O-E, boy, and it's the long form of hobo. And these were day laborers. And if you didn't go around with a farm implement, and by the way, the railroad, Southern and Central Pacific Railroad mogul, Collis Huntington, when the subject of a hoboy came up to him, he said, "That young man should be happy he has a hoe. There's capital there. That's his capital. He can earn a living. Don't talk to me about difficult lives." So I have this image just to show riding the rails. It was extremely dangerous. Jack London did it. Enough of these, enough of the jute mill, enough of the cannery, enough of the steam laundry. He'd worked in a steam laundry. If you ask who starched Cornelius Vanderbilt's collars, he did. In the hot California temperatures such as those we have right now, where you feel you could just pass out. The starch vats, scalding to your hands, to plunge in. How could he then translate some of that experience to a public that needed to know what was going on behind the coreless engine, behind all those consumer products? What devastation for the lives being lived out of sight. When the gold rush in Alaska came up in 1896, London jumped at the opportunity. Bear in mind, California was full of stories of the 49ers. Sutter's Mills, all that, veins of gold. Now Alaska. If you can stand it, you might strike it rich. More lottery tickets. He went with his brother-in-law, who was in his 60s and should never have done it. The brother-in-law turned back. Jack spent a hell of a winter of 1897 in the gold fields. All the scholars say one thing about that experience. He found no actual gold, but he found the gold that he milled and mined for the rest of his career. The stories he heard around the campfires with the Inuits, the gold hunters, the old sourdoughs and the newcomers, the dogs, the freezing sub-zero temperatures, the sleds, the ambitions, the murders, all of it became his capital. And when his mother said, "Try to write," that's what he finally was able to do. And this is his breakout book. This is the cover of the first edition, Call of the Wild. By then, this is 1903, and he had been writing for almost 5 years, selling a little, not quite enough, sell some more. The two stories that broke through and gave him serious recognition appeared in one high-toned West Coast magazine, the Overland Monthly, and on the East Coast, the Atlantic Monthly. And they were stories of Alaska, of the exotic life there. Bear in mind that recreational reading often ran to the National Geographic of the time. People were interested, sitting in their parlors, being comfortable, having their clothes starched and made for them by other people, nice and comfy, in upholstered furniture, reading about the exotic lives of the other. See those dogs? If you reread Call of the Wild, how many of you have read it, ever? Okay. You know, story of freedom, right? Of a search for self, of identity, of rite of passage. But if you think about those dogs as industrial workers, harnessed in, driven every day, beaten, never fed enough so that they had to cadge food from one another. So every one that was full was at the cost of one that wasn't full. If you reread it that way, you might see the emergence of the public intellectual who's trying indirectly, not hammering the audience, entertaining and teaching at the same time, always keeping in mind the need to entertain, to find the publisher who would agree, to find the audience who would welcome the name of Jack London. And this was the breakout book. Within a short time, it had sold 1.7 million copies. Bear in mind, the population is about 90 million in the country. Who read him? Workers like to read him. Literate workers who had some time, draymen, metal workers, stable hands, military men. If you do some research at the Huntington Library and the Jack London collection, you find orders from the Navy, from the Army, 20 copies for one base, 40 copies for another base. But also, he was reaching the new class of bourgeois professionals and managers. Hotel managers, dentists, insurance agents, women who joined their garden clubs, church groups, synagogues, people who were living respectable lives in the new suburbs, outside those nasty, dirty cities. They were retreating, as Theodore Dreiser said, to little islands of prosperity, but they were intrigued by what was going on elsewhere and wanting to break out of the Victorian straightened ways of thinking. He appealed, Jack London did, to that group, and it's very important that he do so. I'm getting to the Seawolf. Hang on. Very important. He's married by now. I don't have an image of his first wife. It was an unfortunate marriage. He had 2 daughters by her, Bess. He always supported them. He always supported his mother and of course his nanny, always. This is Charmian Kittredge London. They are married. If you go to Jack London State Park, and fortunately the state parks are still open, you'll see where they lived, and you'll see his farm, his actual acreage. So life is good. Life is good. This is the photograph I want to point out. It was taken from the Alaska, with the Alaskan kind of image. That's a fur collar, leather jacket. And in 1985, he was enough of an American iconic figure that he got postage stamp. It's interesting to think who is first denounced for threatening to ruin society and later lauded with a stamp. When Jack London published some of his work, some of his socialist essays, because he was politically a socialist, the owner and publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Otis Chandler, inveighed against him as a destroyer of all good order, a wrecker who would ruin society. Chandler stepped in to edit a piece that his own reporter had done on London. Now London gets a postage stamp. Time moves on. I simply want to show that he was a sailor. And he knew the ropes, the lines, because in the Sea Wolf, it's important that the nautical terms and acts be accurate. Let me mention that at Vanderbilt University, I included this novel a couple of years ago and asked undergraduates to make presentations. 2 or 3 of the guys thought, how could a rogue wave really be that? That's just fiction. They did the research. They were able to document the events that take place in the novel. Now, obviously, every event was not researched, but they did not find fiction. They found representations of actuality at sea. This is London's yacht, Snark. He sailed to Hawaii, he sailed to the South Seas, became terribly ill, had to sell the boat and stop the voyage that was intended to be around the world. He had shipped out, as I mentioned earlier, at age 17 on a seal hunting schooner up to the Bering Sea, the Sophia Sutherland. He shipped out as an able-bodied seaman, which is 1 cut or 2 above the entry-level rank. He was always very proud of that. He was a sailor all his life, sailed the waters of the San Francisco Bay, and 2 boats of his own, Spray and Romer. Therefore, he knows his nautical stuff. This is the jacket cover of the Sea Wolf hardcover, and I'm going to come into what I think we need to pay attention to. Public intellectual, Jack London, 1904. And we see it's supposed to be Wolf Larsen up there looking very threatening. And of course, London's name, quite prominent at the bottom. And one last, yes. The captains of industry, I'm sorry, they're blurred. I wanted captains to be on screen because I would like us to take a kind of turn. A turn away from the Sea Wolf as a book of nautical adventure, as a love story, as a Nietzschean exploration of philosophy, as a Darwinian meditation on evolution, social Darwinism, all of which has been written about, on the influences of London in relation to a notorious seal hunter from Canada, and consider that at a time when the mentality, the psychology of the robber barons was of interest to U.S. readers. This population exists in a state, this is the phrase, of unstable equilibrium where their passions flame like prairie grass. If we think of the only crewman who might ally with Humphrey and Maude is Johnson. All the others are in some basic way impaired. Conspicuous by their absence are the robust, stable crewmen of the working class who might be shown to combat Larsen in an alliance with Van Weyden, with Hump. They appear in other of Jack London's stories and novels. I'm going to cite, there's a story called The Dream of Debs, in which unionized workers basically go on strike, and the upper class has to realize that the infrastructure of their lives has disappeared, from their morning cream to the oats bags for their livery stables. Another story is called South of the Slot, set in San Francisco, and then in a novel called The Valley of the Moon, published in 1912, and the University of California Press has reissued it in their series on California writers. So, except for one lone stalwart, this is Johnson, readers of The Sea Wolf must look elsewhere in London's fiction and essays to find strong, brainy, working-class figures. The Sea Wolf, in The Sea Wolf, London cleared the decks and forecastle of such crewmen. Those decks become instead the stage on which London presents the potential in action for the bourgeoisie, that is, for his middle and upper middle class readers to become major players in the country's necessary revolution. In combat against the captain, it is they and they alone that occupy the main stage in this novel. Nationally, it's the likes of Humphrey Van Weyden, Hump, and Maud Brewster who are charged with constraining and neutralizing the industrial era tyrants. It is they, as the Sea Wolf makes clear, who have the intellectual potential, the social savvy, the cultural capital, and the willpower that can and must be summoned for this monumental imperative. Not, of course, in their former lives of cosseted gentility, for they must undergo a rite of passage in life's rough and tumble. The bourgeoisie must thus stiffen their spines and confront the incorrigible, intractable captains of industry. Doing so, the bourgeoisie can be saved from themselves. This was Jack London's message even before he sailed to the North and South Pacific. This was his message, that the bourgeoisie, signified by Hump and Maud, must gather their resources and confront the incorrigible and intractable captains of industry. They must undertake the project of social reform. They must get these kids out of the coal mines and out of the textile mills. They must get the likes of a Jack London out of the jute mill, out of the cannery, for decent wages, for reasonable working conditions, for safety assurances on machinery that had no hoods. It's for the Humphreys and the Mauds to take a hand and become stakeholders in a world that desperately needs their efforts in reform. And that's where I'm closing to say, we have an example of the novelist who's a public intellectual, who's trying to shape public opinion and trying to do it in ways that will result in better public policies. That vile, denigrated word, regulations, if you like. So through his fiction, and it's an invitation, I think, to look at the fiction of others and ask to what extent their canons are databases, and to factor in, along with the sociologists, the political luminaries, so forth, the impact that the writers are having with their own narratives, their own poetry. And so this is, it seems to me, an optimal moment to rethink in literary studies the relation of the writer to the public, and the writer as an influencer of public thought and action. So when we look at this period and we see the major figures, we're not seeing the writers included. It's so interesting. Landmark books that historians write. Jackson Lears had just written one, something like The Rebirth of America from the 1870s into the 1920s. London's not even in the index. Who else isn't there? Who ought to be there? What case can be made? This is a time, it seems to me, to redraw the map in your terms, and you're the ones to do it. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you, when you ask questions, to make sure that you get the microphone.
I see a hand, but you know, I'm constrained by my own microphone. I dare not venture forth. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I really liked your presentation. So I had a question about the part when the transfer from the boat to Endeavor Island, and kind of, I guess you mentioned in Call to Wild the dogs, and then obviously the seals play a role here, and the scene with the brutalization of the seals.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how, if you're suggesting that the intellectual characters of Humphrey and Maud are supposed to be, I guess, like the new rulers of society or something like that, to free us from the industrial grasp of moguls, how like their transformation on this island by brutalizing seals plays into that reading.
That is you call attention to a really riveting episode. So interesting that London reserves to this novel that episode because he had been on the Sophia Sutherland. He had to pound those seals at age 17, 18. In this instance, I think that giving Wolf Larsen the critique of devastation of wildlife to serve fashion, which Larsen does initially. This is because of what women want. Women want furs, and we go out and kill seals to give them their furs. I think that later in the island, what London has in mind for Humphrey and Maud is survival. I think there are two things, in other words, two things in relation to the seals, and the third. You might remember a moment when Maud brings up David Starr Jordan's name as someone who's an expert in seal colonies. Jordan was the first president of Stanford University, and he and London had a connection that I'm not going to foray into, so we can get out and have dinner. But initially, when Wolfe trivializes the reason for the seal hunt. It makes a lot of money, but it's because of women's whims. I think that's an authentic critique on London's part. The work was so dangerous for the men. The bull seals, you know, you didn't want to tangle with them. Go down to La Jolla to the so-called Children's Beach and see if you want to confront one of those seals. You do not. So they're not just sweet little like the little stuffed animals, and so it's Larsen is given, I think, an authentic point of critique. Later on, I think that what London wants us to see is survivalism for those two. But that in itself, now that would be an interesting possible paper topic, because you could get all kinds of things in there, that is, issues. Taxidermy, who's doing that and why, and what trophies, women's fashion, who's doing that work, what's the psychological impact of that work, and if you do that, you want to look at that. But you come down and see me afterward. There's a book about that Canadian seal hunter who was a really notorious rogue, much in the news as as an adventurer. All right.
Thanks.
I see someone in the balcony.
Hi, I also really enjoyed your lecture. I had a question about your conception of Maud and Van Weyden as kind of the bourgeois figures whose job it is to basically overthrow the tyranny of the captains of industry. But I'm confused because it seems to me that Maud and Van Weyden don't actually do anything like that. They escape from the ship, and then the other thing that happens is that Larsen ultimately is just overthrown by his own sickness, right? It's kind of, and it's also, it's not something that's really something you can ascribe to a certain kind of activity that he does. It's a stroke which seems to come out of nowhere, right? And then also, I wonder if you could also speak to how the book ends, as punctuating it very much as it felt like as a romance story.
Yes.
And how that fits into your reading of them as...
Excellent questions all. They need to, I used the word, they need to neutralize him. London was on a tightrope of entertainment and reformist messages. When he wrote his straight-ahead political, even some fiction, The Dream of Debs, that one about the strike in which the organized workers crippled the country's infrastructure. And then we see the savagery of the elites and the savagery of those at the very bottom of society as they, for instance, wrangle over a horse carcass because they're starving. That story bounced from one magazine to the other and finally appeared in a socialist magazine. London had to earn his living. He spent a lot. He earned a lot. He was the first American author to earn $1 million. When $1 million was $1 million, now it's $1 billion. So he had to entertain. He could not abandon that personal mandate. When comes that moment, and you remember it, when Humph has a knife and he could stab Larson, he could kill him. I think London could not, for reasons of audience receptivity, let him do it. And he had also, for reasons of audience receptivity, to be able to have a book promoted, the book promoted for its romance as well. So those are the entertainment dimensions, and it's true, they do, they soften, I think, that message. I can't deny that for a moment. I think the message, though, is still in place, that the bourgeoisie need to test out the moralistic nostrums that they've learned to spout in school. That phrase from Milton, virtue untested is no virtue. And we have to see London saying, the Humphreys and the Mauds, you need to get down and dirty and see what's going on, and it'll be good for you, and you'll be stronger, and you'll be prepared no longer to be an enabler of the status quo, or kind of a, what do I say, looking for a word that suggests that you just cower and wait and hope nobody bothers you, because you've got your trust fund, you have your nice home, maybe you have a security service to protect you. Get into it. See what the situation is. When you read, for instance, the former. This is going off, off the train here, but let me do it for just a minute. There was a book, it made quite a stir a few years ago, called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Young guy who worked for Bain Consulting, from which Bain Capital spun off. And he and the dean of the business school, Columbia University, basically say the same thing. Here's what they say. High-level management. Here we are in the Drucker School. High-level management, but Peter Drucker, I think, would never approve of this. They jet in, let's say to Indonesia. They land at the airport. They're helicoptered to their hotel. They have their meetings in a high-rise suite, the hotel, out of sight of what's going on at the ground. They take pride, the highest level, of not having to visit these places around the world. The John Perkins, the economic hitman, who had been in the Peace Corps, was invited by some, and he'd gone to, I think, Middlebury College, fine college, and some at, I think, Boston University, my old stomping ground. He was eyed by someone on the staff in the hotel who said, "Would you like to see what's really going on? Spend an evening with us." Down from the suite in the Intercontinental, whatever hotel, and off into the slums and see what's really going on. And these energies will not stay suppressed forever. And of course we're seeing some of this now, outbreaks, the so-called Arab Spring. That's what I think London wants his bourgeois readers to do. Get amongst the crew, see what's going on, see what the cost of this level of autocracy, tyranny is and costs, and do something about it. There's a book from about that time, about 1902, called by Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, something like Our New Medievalism. It argues that rather than the vassals of the king, we have the enablers, who are the entourage of the captains of industry, right down to the ministry, the professoriate, the editors, and so we could say now the whole media, and they are the enablers, and they are the courtiers of today. Our new medieval, I think, order. That book, something like that. London had it in his library and relied upon it, and that's exactly what he found. That the official versions, the sort of situation we're in now, right now, this afternoon, is a cushioning. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, the Foxconn workers revolted last night and were beaten by the security guards. So we can all have our new iPhones. It's a much longer answer than you want. No one will dare put up their hand because you'll get a speech out of that woman. Is that, I think he just had to pull his punches to sell the books. But he also wanted that message in there. And I think it's in there.
I want to thank you also because I think your reading really clarified what to me were I was uncertain really about what London's position was. Seemed to me, and I don't know if anyone else experienced this, maybe I'm, but in the beginning I felt like Wolf Larsen was almost an admirable character, especially in comparison with Humphrey, who was, as he said, living off of dead hands, or but I thought I agree completely, that the kind of middle class has to kind of face the cost of their privilege, and I think that the seal clubbing is kind of a part of that.
Yeah. But
I was wondering. And I also thought that. The fact that they don't really overthrow him is sort of a fact of the situation, that I think he sort of wrote himself into a corner because they have to take it. They're not going to give it up. And so it has to be taken away.
Yes.
And so I was just wondering what you thought about that. But also I thought something else that was kind of interesting to me was Wolf as sort of a pathetic character, because even though he is cruel and selfish and stubborn, he does read the books, and he does seem interested.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that he was just a sort of a sad character.
Yes, and lonely, and Humphrey realizes this about him. Just and your observation is especially important in sort of alerting me to bring up very briefly one other point. London did not want in any way to unwind the achievements of the industrial order. What he said was, you have found a way to create material bounty for masses of people, and you haven't done it. And instead, you have been abysmal failures at the distribution of the wealth you yourselves have created. We have to take you out of your system so that your system can be made to work for us. And when asked, what about you as a socialist? And regrettably, socialism got lumped with communism and anarchism, anything that ended in ism, and London said, we're social beings. We want the best social world for all of us, maximally. Isn't that what we want? Well, let's get on it. Here's what we need to do. So Wolf Larsen, and notice that London endows him with the invention of a navigation device that really does work, really simplifies navigation. It's going to be an important improvement. So just as Carnegie recognized the value of reinvesting in steel so it would be produced with maximal efficiency and strength for all sorts of uses, purposes, so Larsen, in these regards, a valuable figure, thoughtful. Carnegie wrote a lot, trying to justify his world, his activities, society and relation, and so on. So it's not to make the Larsen some kind of thug, but to say these are figures of high achievement, but they've sort of gone off the rails in relation to the people who live in the world they created and work for them. Yeah. Oh, good, a woman. Guys. yeah, and then we're all gonna.
It's a lot of pressure. So I was wondering, we've talked about the message for the bourgeois reader that he had. What would you say is his message for his wide worker audience? I mean, the seals don't really revolt. No. I mean, there's not like a lot of inspiration with those seals if you lump yourselves
they're
with
not.
them.
No, I think it's not there. That's a really good question, because he shows so often the defeat of the workers. He was a member of the Socialist Party. He admired the union effort, the organized labor. He also saw how organized labor could become its own worst, or one of the worst of its own worst enemies. If we look at, I suggest, there's a story called South of the Slot. South of the Slot, not too long. It features a sort of Humphrey, and he's a young professor of economics at Berkeley. And to do kind of field work, he goes down to the slums, and he sees unionists, men, women, and he becomes drawn to that world. He likes it. It's real. They're making headway. They're getting better wages. And at the end of the story, the Berkeley professor, he's got one name, I remember, and he uses a pseudonym down there when he's doing his field work. And he's fallen for a woman who's, I think, the head of the glove makers union. And he has a moment when he has to decide who he is. And he goes to the workers, because that's where the vitality is. London himself found that his best intellectual conversations were with non-conventional academics who had been ousted from their positions. There was no tenure at that time. And some hobos who were really thoughtful, some guys like Larsen who just did some reading and were thinking about things, and so those figures thread their way through his stories, and you can find them. I would suggest The Valley of the Moon as a book that really takes up the workers, their power, their authority, and how they can exert it, and how they sometimes fail as well.
So I was interested in what you were saying about this novel being kind of like an immediate appeal to his readership. And it reminded me of something that kind of bothered me in the novel, which was London's almost inexplicable back and forth between present tense and past tense. I was just wondering if you made anything of that. If people, it seemed like obvious to me, but maybe it's not so obvious.
No, it's just something, it kind of got by me. I think that I'll tell you what, I find his descriptions, and he once said that his real skill is elaboration, that he struggles with plots. And that might be a kind of cue to what bothers you. The plotting, the sequence of plot, the arc of the plot, he struggles with that. He's great when here's a sea storm, let's do it. Here's a scene in the galley with Leech, let's do that. But when he's got to do the shifting, I think the plot problems are there.
I guess maybe I was wondering if it could have been a justification for kind of slipping in the present tense as, hey, this is an immediate thing. It's not just a recollection.
He does do that. He does do that, and he does it in his narrative of the cruise of the Snark. It's called, and he was going to call his sailboat Gull, Gull. His poet friend said Snark. That's terrible name. But it's as if, as one of the crewmen said, that boat was born under an ill star, a bad star, and he switches into the present tense for storms. Suddenly there's a squall, and there we are. The immediacy. I think he wants the immediacy then. Yeah.
You have one last